Hello everybody, and welcome back to the Exposition Table. I'm your host, Joe, and there's no co-host today. Dan was busy, so I am left to my own devices to bring out a video to you guys. So I was thinking, what would be the perfect video to do while Dan is gone? Well, I'll talk about one of my personal favorite video game series. I'm here today to rank all of the mainline Monster Rancher games, and to just generally give my opinions on each one. I have 5 ranks right here, S, A, B, C, and D. And while I'm not going to necessarily say like an S is a 10 out of 10 or a D is a complete waste of data, I will say that like these are games that I enjoy quite a bit. And video games that kind of get my goat, if you know what I mean. The series does mean a lot to me, and obviously there's not like that many Monster Rancher games, it's not a very big franchise, so I have been waiting to really get my opinions out there on each game. I'll be doing this in release order, so Monster Rancher 1. Released in 1997, this is the first game of the series, obviously. I think it's a C-grade game. Going back to it, especially given the release of Monster Rancher 1 and 2 DX, I do think that while the core gameplay is still quite polished and quite a good time, I do think that Monster Rancher 1 feels particularly lacking nowadays. The roster is small, and considering how many breeds have to be unlocked, the roster feels smaller than it is in reality. Like, there's only 20 main breeds, and many of them might as well not exist for how much you have to go out of your way to do it. And unfortunately, that doesn't quite pay off, because Monster Rancher 1 is a very easy game. So, by the time you are good enough to unlock all the monsters, the game has no more challenges left for you, and it really hurts Monster Rancher 1's replayability, because while it's a pleasant experience with very nice visuals and music, and has a very homey atmosphere that most of the other games don't quite match, in my opinion, there's just not a whole lot to do when you're playing Monster Rancher 1. And it just kind of hurts the game, and going back to it is, it's good for a nice casual run-through, but don't really get a whole lot out of it. And while I'm not going to be weighing competitive viability much, the combat is all sorts of weird and the balancing is crazy, with all the guts damage to prevent your opponents from even attacking, which leads to some very unintuitive game feel. That being said, I do appreciate how every stat feels valuable in Monster Rancher 1, because stat balance is definitely a problem that the series tends to tangle with more often than not. I just think it's a pretty good time, but it's definitely shown its age disproportionate to how compared to a lot of the other games which are nearly as old as it. And that's just kind of unfortunate. I recommend that someone play Monster Rancher 1, especially since it is out on Monster Rancher DX. So there's pretty much like the easiest game to access in the series, tied with Monster Rancher 2, of course. So, you know, it's accessible. You support the franchise by getting Monster Rancher 1. So why not? I think it is, pretty much picturesque C tier. And that leads to its sequel, Monster Rancher 2, which is often quoted as being the fan favorite, and I'm not too much of an exception to this. It is one of my favorite games. Monster Rancher 2 takes most of what 1 does and refines it, cranks up the presentation. Has an insane roster of 38 main breeds, which is still the most of any game in the series, which is quite impressive. And on top of refining the gameplay of Monster Rancher 1, they just add a lot more content. The Legend Cup, the IMA Fimba meets, those are like challenges that you really have to work for. The game rewards you for learning its mechanics, which are quite deep, so you really feel like you have to work to get to the finish line. It's not like Monster Rancher 1 where anyone with a sizable competency can really finish the game in one go. It's going to take some planning unless you're already good at it. I do think that Monster Rancher 2 has a better general game feel. I do have a few issues with Monster Rancher 2, but not nearly as many as I did with 1, where I spent just as much time complaining or giving critique to the game than I did praising it. Monster Rancher 2 does do a few things that kind of get under my skin over time. I guess it's also exposure due to being the fan favorite, so I just am more intimately aware of this. This used to be my favorite game, still probably my top 5. Just saying that. The defense stat is pretty bad. There are some breeds that are blatantly overpowered. If you know, you know. Metalner. If you know, you know. Mochi, before they on the opposite side of that scale. And some monsters have like over a dozen variations. Others feel like they barely exist. Some monsters have really incomplete movesets compared to others. Like, while I do think this game is quite grand in scope, I still feel like some of the cracks definitely show. Monsters like Hopper and Joker feel like they're kind of half-made. But overall, I do think that Monster Rancher 2 is still a very good time. It's very accessible. A lot of people play it. You can find an online game pretty easily. There's usually tournaments being run. If you want to play a Monster Rancher game competitively and get in touch with the community, Monster Rancher 2 is kind of the go-to for that. And to this day, I can have a lot of fun with it. I go back to it from years in the past and the years to come. Monster Rancher 3 from 2001 is a very interesting game. It shelves the quasi-realism of Monster Rancher 2 and replaces it with a more cartoony, lighthearted, whimsical art style to a point which was much division when the game came out. It scales the roster back to 30 instead of 38, still more than Monster Rancher 1's 20, but palpably less than 38. It did a lot of really interesting mechanical changes, such as rival characters that would frequently visit you and challenge you in tournaments, which really expanded the game loop so it didn't feel quite as repetitive, as different characters would come around, have stuff to say, give you fights against rotating monsters. So the game was definitely not as stale when it comes to playing it for years and years on. Like, yeah, every tournament, every rank in these games generally has its familiar faces. Like Monster Rancher 2, you're gonna see Oakley Man time and time again. In Monster Rancher 4, you're gonna see Smollett in intro many times over. But in Monster Rancher 3, well yes, every tournament does have its standard roster of monsters. Rivals will cycle in more monsters, and if you release a monster from your storage, your rivals can use them, which is a neat detail. You're probably not going to run into it on a casual playthrough, but it's really neat. It shelves the combination features that made the first 2 games so distinct, and most games thereafter, by having 5 ranches that you go to, and you feed monsters different foods, and they'll adapt and evolve to fit their environment. Like, monsters will have, like, whiter colors when they go to Brilla, which is a tundra. They'll be adapted to the cold, or they'll adapt to the desert and take on a different form, which is a neat way to organize sub-breeds and all that. And while I do love me some combination, I do have to admit, evolution was a cool idea, and it definitely freshened the well when it came to variations, especially considering that the first 2 games had pretty bland combination results. Like, a lot of monster sub-breeds were very uninteresting, oftentimes just being recolors with some slight texture changes. Monster Rancher 3 is a lot more dynamic with their designs. Not to say that 1 and 2 didn't have good combinations, just there's a lot of very standard ones. Monster Rancher 3 really got the shredded stuff. Alongside accessories, which can allow you to customize the monster's appearance, it's the first game that allows you to customize your movesets, so you can choose not to use a move your monster might have, which is definitely an obstacle when it comes to certain builds in the earlier games, I'll tell you that much. With all this saying, Monster Rancher 3 is quite good. Over time, it has kind of climbed up my ranks. It used to be one of my least favorite mainline games, but nowadays, I'd say that Monster Rancher 3 is pretty solid. It made a questionable decision to merge the speed and accuracy stats into one. Now, those were both very powerful stats in the past, and I guess consolidating them makes a very mandatory stat, but, you know, most people are going to build speed or accuracy anyway. Often both. So, when it comes to high-level play, it doesn't really change much. Now, some of the cons of the game, I would say, are the game has a kind of a slow game feel. The menus feel a little slow. I do like the combat system of it quite a bit, although I do kind of find that raising monsters is a little tedious when compared to the games around it. Your early stages of your life, monsters just fail a lot of drills, and there's no way around it, and it's just really frustrating to start a new monster. Instead of combination, the way to progress is to let your monster die and become a heart crystal so you can inherit their abilities, traits, which were added in this game, which are passive effects. So instead of freezing a monster, you let a monster die and combine them. Like, you inherit stats instead of combining. You get abilities. You have to search out items to get your abilities this time. I didn't really mention for the first two games, but in Monster Ranchers 1 and 2, you'd go on an errand tree, which is where you send your monster out to the wilderness for a month, and increase their stats of the ones you choose, of the locale you choose to do your errand tree in. And then, they may or may not learn a move if they meet the requirements. They might die, they might get injured. In Monster Rancher 3, you get an item, like 4 types of gemstones or 3 different tiers each, and then you give them to a lord monster when you explore your ranch once a season, and then you only have 4 move slots, and you can level up your attacks, which is pretty unique. I don't really think they do it ever again, but yeah, it's fascinating. I do find that I don't have as much fun raising a monster in Monster Rancher 3 as I do with the others, but I feel like it does a little too much well to put it below B tier. I'm gonna put it in B tier. Monster Rancher Advance 1. If there was a beginner's Monster Rancher game, Advance 1 would be it. Monster Rancher Advance is released in 2001 for the Game Boy Advance, pretty obvious. Monster Rancher Advance 1, being a GBA game, does scale back a few things. There's no adventures. There's only 20 monsters. The things you do to unlock monsters has been fairly standardized. You only have to unlock 4 different breeds by doing invitations to ones with higher ranks. In order to learn skills, you don't go on an errand tree, you don't collect gems, you send your monster out sparring for a month against a teacher or one of your coaches, which you can use your old monsters to become new training partners, which gives Monster Rancher Advance a very interesting game loop where you're definitely going to start off a little rough, but not just because you don't have enough money, but because you can buy passive items as you get more money, and as you have stronger monsters in the past, you can be able to beef up your training options. Monster Rancher Advance is a pretty straightforward game. There's not really too much plot. You just go up to the ranks, D, no E rank even, to S. You do the major 4. You fight the big legendary cup at the end, and then the credits roll. It's the most default Monster Rancher game in existence to get monsters. In the past, use CDs or a database. In Monster Rancher Advance, use passwords. Which, yeah, it's pretty neat. I do love Advance on a few levels. I think out of all the assistant characters, which are pretty much the main avatars, as most Monster Rancher games involve you in first person instead of being an active character. The assistants in Aroma and Zest are just, they have a lot of neat lines and flashes of characterization. While the likes of Flaria and Monster Rancher 3 definitely had a personality, Monster Rancher 1 and 2 was pretty bare on any writing, and I do think Advance really strikes a pretty good balance. And unlike Monster Rancher 1, which also had 20 breeds, you are going to see and be able to use every monster in the game fairly easily, and Advance is definitely more challenging than Monster Rancher 1. The end game monsters are tough. The strongest opponent, Monster Rancher 1, had around 400 in every stat to 500. While in Monster Rancher Advance, you're getting monsters like straight 700s, 800s. Monsters start approaching the stat cap in certain stats. Advance is definitely, while basic, it is a little intense. Advance isn't a big game. It's not a game with a lot to do necessarily, but at being a basic Monster Rancher game, I do think that Advance does beat out Monster Rancher 1 overall. I think Advance puts up more of a fight, it makes more of an impression. There are some genuinely nice moments of characterization. I will always remember when Aroma and Zest talk about their experience with their deceased mother, or Aroma trying to get Zest with the mail lady, Ayase. And I don't know, I find that neat. It looks very nice for a GBA game. It really does feel like you have a miniature version of Monster Rancher 2 in your hands. This was also, admittedly, the game I grew up playing the most. But I have to give credit to... This is starting to read like a B instead of a C. I'm going to put it up B tier. I think Monster Rancher Advance is a fundamentally solid Monster Rancher experience. You can't really go wrong with Monster Rancher Advance. Monster Rancher Advance 2 came out 1 year later in 2002. It is, for better and for worse, a more complicated, more developed, broader experience than Monster Rancher Advance 1. For better and for worse. Instead of just being able to stack better trainers as your coaches, a monster can only be a coach for so long. This adds more depth to the game, but it also does make things a little more annoying. Sparring to get new moves requires your monster to have higher stats and ranks to get new moves. So getting moves is definitely a lot harder in Advance 2. You might be stuck with your starting text for a while. The roster has thickened up to the nice, solid 30 with a mix of new and old monsters from the time. Monster Rancher Advance 2, or as said here, Monster Farm 2, which is the Japanese name for the franchise, is definitely one of the most complete Monster Rancher games out there, including complicated unlocking systems, which you may give or take. Adventures are back in the style of Monster Rancher 1. You can do them every week instead of just doing it when the adventure guy shows up. Unfortunately, it has the Monster Rancher 1 expedition system, where your monster has a pretty good chance at running away. So I hope you like save scumming, because that's going to be a problem. And it's Soulmates, where your monster can find friends out in the wild so they can bond and get a once per tournament special attack. There are legendary monsters where you can get specific passwords and unlock variations. And Advance 2 has a nice, simple, fleshed out story. It's definitely one of the most lively feeling monster entry games. And honestly, it has pretty charming writing as well, much like Advance 1. To the point where, in many ways, it feels like a monster entry game with more soul than any other game in the series. There's just a lot that Advance 2 brings to the table. Now, an understated problem I haven't mentioned yet when it comes to Monster Rancher Advanced games is that they are a little chunky. You don't have the best combat system, but Advance 2 definitely fleshes things out a bit more. More status effects, counters. Counters are a very contentious subject in Monster Rancher. I will say, I do prefer counters when they're a little less overtuned, where you could potentially take a gamble on interrupting an opponent's attack. And if you fail a counter, guess the wrong input, you'll eat a guaranteed hit with an increased critical hit chance. Monster Rancher Advance 2 definitely kind of looks more like Monster Rancher 3 with its designs, as it came out well after 3, so it had a chance to develop. But I do think it has a nice balance between the visual styles of Advance 1 and Monster Rancher 3. It's a very, very pleasing game, nice music. It's very well-rounded. I do think, due to the lack of a versus mode that you can spectate, it is worse when it comes to PvP, which is the reason why the community really hasn't tried to approach it, because you kind of want AI versus AI in Monster Rancher multiplayer. And had that been an option for Monster Rancher Advance 2 and 1, I would be far more gung-ho about trying to hold some Monster Rancher Advance tournaments. That being said, Monster Rancher Advance 2. It's a fun time. It takes what worked about Advanced, fleshes it out, perhaps making the process a little more complicated, a little more annoying. There's more dialogue, more story. So, depending on what you're going into your Monster Rancher game for, if you just want pure ranching action, there is a lot of stuff you're going to have to go through. But I do say this is a complete package. It's a very good game. Okay, so in 2003, the best Monster Rancher game, Monster Rancher 4, came out. Okay, yeah. Anyone who knows me, anyone who's interacted with me online, anyone who's interacted with me in real life, would know that Monster Rancher 4 is my second favorite video game, only behind Kingdom Hearts 1. And only just above Dark Souls 1. Monster Rancher 4 is a game that I hold dearly to my heart, warts and all. Which is how I feel about the franchise as a whole. Monster Rancher 4 is story heavy when you go through the campaign. You play as Thane, a young upstart breed who was expelled from the prestigious Aleve school in Visley. Why is that? You'll have to find out. He's holding some secrets. As you'll eventually meet up with the old school chums, you ally yourself and befriend a mysterious girl with the ability to communicate with monsters directly in their language. As you travel around the Monster Rancher world, you go to various cities, and you see the general climate of a changing time. The Ajima Association proving itself worthy to stand behind Ayame and Fimba, the settings of Monster Ranchers 1 and 2, respectively. Well, actually, Fimba is Monster Rancher 1, and Ayame is Monster Rancher 2, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Or just carried away with lore. And what that means is that you really get a feel for how the Monster Rancher world is at some indeterminate time after 1 and 2. Fimba is struggling to keep up with changing times. Torbol, a city which you only just heard about within a university in Monster Rancher 2, you go there, as you notice that the Monster Rancher world isn't just a standard Renaissance era fantasy. Parts of the world are going under an industrial revolution. And with the rise of industrialization, there's a rise in cruel work practices. And it's funny how talk about the politics of the Industrial Revolution, and it's actually a pretty big plot point in the middle of Monster Rancher 4, as stricter training trends show up with training gadgets and biological alteration. I didn't word that the best, but it kind of goes there, and it kind of and realize, like, yeah, breeders are going to commit crueler acts because the associations appear to be in some sort of arms race to show that they can raise stronger monsters. And some characters are going to want to impress their colleagues, and they'll do some pretty dark things to get there. I like Monster Rancher 4 a lot. And while yes, its story is not the best told, it is mostly just portraits and text. You know what? I have a soft spot for the little story that went on here. I like the characters. I wish you got to do more with them. But not that gameplay. You build your ranch, you set up training gadgets, you raise multiple monsters. While he does lose some of the intimacy that other games have, it makes up for with a very pleasant art style, great music, a divisive dungeon system where instead of just controlling your monster on a grid to collect items, you delve into dungeons to level up and learn new moves, get loot, and fight wild monsters. The traits have been expanded, and you can attach elements to your attacks to augment them. The battle system is quite chaotic. Counters return, they are a little overtuned. Monsters have resistances to elements and physical styles of attacks. Some monsters can take blunt, piercing damage, slashing damage at varying degrees of efficiency. Monster Rancher 4 is kinda crazy. There are buffs and debuffs that are constantly flaring up as your monster dodges, lands attacks, eats hits. And sometimes it does feel like you're playing in a psychotic pachinko machine. God damn it, when you get a good game going in Monster Rancher 4, there is no other game quite like it. I love this game. Yes, it can be a little weird. Yes, the grinding can be really annoying in dungeons. Yes, counters are overpowered. Yes, attaching lore's elements to attacks is honestly a little overtuned. But what Monster Rancher game doesn't have is combat jank. Monster Rancher 2's Guts Correction, which is a mechanic where monsters with more guts have bonuses, is so overtuned that a monster will lose a match if it whiffs a single attack. Monster Rancher 3 has no equivalent to Grit or Final Guts, so if a monster's down, there's no chance at a rematch. Every Monster Rancher game has its own collection of jank, and that's not necessarily to say that Monster Rancher 4 doesn't have problems. Nirvana and Composure are overpowered or far too common, so dodge tanking can be a little overtuned. I do not like how you can't unfreeze a monster, so once you take a monster out, you gotta finish him. I do adore, however, the art direction. I think that the monsters look their best here. I think that as the solid roster of 33, second highest to this day, 33 main breeds. And they're colorful, they're vibrant, they're expressive, they're cool. As the perfect balance between detail and cartoonist whimsy. I adore this game. I know it has problems, but this is my game. This is my game, and I'm unabashedly going to put this in the top spot. I hold tournaments for this game. Please give it a remaster, Tecmo. I know you're not watching this, but please. I will shill this game until the day I die. Monster Rancher Evo is not a good game. Where do I go with Monster Rancher Evo? Monster Farm 5, The Circus Caravan. I have not played much of this game. I tried to this. I love JRPGs. I find Evo's combat system to be quite boring. I find having to do circus performance, mini games to train your monsters and to get stat gains, incredibly tedious. I love the way this game looks. Being able to explore a town as it grows is really engaging. I cannot stand playing this game. I wish I could love this game, because thematically it is similar to Monster Rancher 4 in many ways. I love the idea of having more human characters to interact with more. I wish this game played like anything else. I'm not going to say much on it. Much more. Evo. Well, first off, it was released in 2005 in Japan, 2006 in North America. It was it was the last console Monster Rancher game until 2022. It makes me sad, because I see a version of this game in my head which is way better and way more my speed. Man, if Evo just built on what made Monster Rancher 4 good and ironed out the presentation and added more stuff, balanced things a bit, man, the series would be so good. But no. They pivoted towards away from the monster racing aspect even more, and we have this very unique game that it's just not for me. Maybe one day I'll be able to return to it, but I'm not a fan of Monster Rancher Evo, sorry to say. Monster Rancher DS, on paper, brilliant. It has a combination of new and old monsters, a solid roster of 29. It has plenty of rival characters, a plethora of content for you to do. The game's engine is so clunky, I cannot stand playing it. I want to adore this game, because it does so much I want to see from Monster Rancher. It's got the standard raising system of Monster Rancher 2 and 1 and Advanced. It's got the expanded lore of Monster Rancher 4 and Advanced 2. It has endgame content, like the Zodiac monsters, and side quests and unlocking and adventures. It's got all of that. But it controls terribly. The gameplay is slow and clunky. Why does every move cost at least 20 guts? Why is the combat so slow? Why is adventuring like the worst thing? Why is controlling the game so laboriously bad? And while it's not relevant now, why is the local multiplayer non-functional? If I could remake any Monster Rancher game, well, it'd be Monster Rancher 4. But after that, Monster Rancher DS was so close to being great, but it has some of the worst game feel I have played of a game made after the 80s. DS frustrates me. As another downside, it's probably the only Monster Rancher game where I actively dislike the music. I can say that about a lot of DS games. Man, it does sting. Because when Monster Rancher music slaps, it freaking slaps. But DS doesn't quite do it for me. And that's a shame. Because after Monster Rancher DS came out in 2008 in Japan, 10 in the US, we did not get another mainline Monster Rancher game until 2022. Monster Rancher DS is the only game on this list I have not played in the past 2 years. I want to go back to it, but I'm going to need a good excuse to. I want to love Monster Rancher DS. Alright, I guess that's about it for DS. Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher is tied or potentially my third favorite game in the series. As a proper 2022 Monster Rancher game, not involving most of the monsters you have known and loved and tolerated from earlier games. You use Ultraman Kaiju. Yes, the first Monster Rancher game in so long is an Ultraman crossover. And it's pretty fun. It is a fun-ass video game. You control Kaiju. You summon them out of a password system or a database system like DX, depending on what version you're playing. The Western release does not have the CD database like DX did, but rather having passwords. They've fleshed out and reevaluated the trait system. Now you have 4 trait slots. You can pull on a gacha to inherit other traits as your monster develops. The training, it might have my favorite training system in the series. You feed your monster several foods, you can combine it with spices so you can augment the flavor and the effects of the food you give to your monster. You train in different locales across a large island, and other kaiju can try to take your territory, and if you claim your territory, you get bonuses in training. Training can get you different kinds of items depending on what training you do. Like, if you want to clear the woods, you can get some spices. If you want to excavate, you can get some valuable selling items. And you fight other kaiju to fight for your territory, and you can get stats for doing that. It is a very, very strong first step into the modern age for Monster Rancher. It is not perfection. I have my issues with it. Due to the nature of kaiju largely being, from a tokusatsu, they're depicted as being men in rubber suits. Well, that's how they made it. It's not like that's canon or anything, as far as I know. So every monster is humanoid except for Suezo. I mean, there are a couple birds. They definitely play around with the system. That doesn't mean a lot of monsters have your basic punches and swipes. They definitely have unique moves, but you'll definitely notice that the monster's kind of samey. I don't know if it's due to the large size or the cluttered interface, but the camera does feel really static. And while the game looks pretty, it runs badly. This game lags a lot. But on the flip side, they made support text varied and nice. It's not just attacking, there's plenty you could do. In combat. There's plenty of stuff you can do in combat. There are buffs. There are status conditions that really matter. Paralysis, and you can slow your opponent down. You can burn them and lower their intelligence. You can freeze them and lower their strength. You can poison them and do severe damage to your opponent over time. And I do love the fleshing out of the combat system. Traits come to play quite a lot. You can manipulate how far you can push your opponent. You can dash like in Monster Rancher 4, but only forward for some reason. Interesting. You can add to an effect if you push back your opponent. It poisons them. You can have bonuses depending on what range you are from the opponent. Monster Rancher 3 had that, but they brought it back for this one. I am so glad for it. They brought back errand trees. The errand trees are a little more basic than they once were in terms of presentation, but it is very much the same errand tree system as 1 and 2, and it's not nearly as awful of a training method as it was in Monster Rancher 2. Much like 1, it's like you actually kind of want to do it for stats sometimes. This game has a very weird way of conducting itself, and it has some problems. The money cap is way too low. The number inflation kind of hides this a bit. But you'll hit the cash cap pretty quickly if you're a competent player and just reaching the end game. You're going to max out money. It is very easy to find the valuable items you're looking for. It is alarmingly easy to get a lot of stuff on adventures, on expeditions. And it feels a little too convenient, I'd want to say. Well, we're talking about things that aren't convenient. I gotta talk about my least favorite part of this game. I hate the rampage system. Sometimes your monster just gets pissed off at very erratic intervals. They'll run off, get lost. They might destroy your ranch and you have to pay a fee. They might run off and increase their stat caps. Or dig up an item. I hate this. I hate how disruptive it is, how it eats weeks. I hate how it's useful sometimes, but super goddamn irritating. I hate that system. If the rampage system didn't exist and the lag was diminished, this would be S tier. But, aside from that, aside from the repetitive dialogue that slows the game down, the lag, and quite frankly, mixed presentation, I think that Ultra Kaiju Monster Rancher is a game that is very much worth getting. It is exclusive to the Switch. I wish that it was on Steam. It'd probably run better, but I all in all, it's a great game. And that was my slightly abridged ranking of all the Monster Rancher titles that follow the traditional Monster Rancher formula. Monster Rancher fans might have noticed I have not talked about a lot of spin-offs. I did not bring up the Battle Card games or Monster Rancher Explorer, which is a Solomon's Key clone. I did not bring up My Monster Rancher or the MMO, because those games do not exist anymore. I have not played Battle Card for the Game Boy. I have played Battle Card Episode 2 for the PlayStation. If I was ranking that, it would be in rank C, right below Monster Rancher 1. It's a pretty good time. It's not my favorite, but I do like it. Well, I certainly hope that you've enjoyed my look at the Monster Rancher games. And next time, I, alongside my co-host Dan, will see you back around the table.